After Carolyn read the Isaiah text a few minutes ago, some of us may well have been tempted to pack up and go home and lay down on the couch and binge watch Netflix for the next, say, 25 or 50 years, or whenever it all crashes down on us. That may have been the most undeniably hopeless text in the Bible. The earth shall be utterly laid waste and utterly despoiled. The world languishes and withers. The heavens languish together with the earth. The earth lies polluted under its inhabitants, for they have transgressed laws and broken the everlasting covenant. I had her read only the first 6 verses this morning, because if we had read the whole chapter, by the end, half of us would be on the floor in a fetal position, weeping. This is horrible stuff. Let me read just a few more lines from Isaiah 24, just a little. I'll keep it PG rated. The wine dries up, the vine languishes, all the merry-hearted sigh. The city of chaos is broken down, every house is shut up so that no one can enter. All joy has reached its eventide. The gladness of the earth is banished. Desolation is left in the city. The gates are battered into ruins. Whoever flees at the sound of terror shall fall into the pit. Whoever climbs out of the pit shall be caught in the snare. The earth is utterly broken. The moon will be abashed and the sun ashamed. These are words of judgment against the whole earth and its inhabitants. A judgment issued by God for failure to obey the universal commands of God. Those moral failures cover the whole gamut of God's commands, all of the Big Ten for sure, and many more. But what is the first recorded commandment of God, a command to the whole human race through the persons of Adam and Eve? That command was to till and keep the garden. First command in the Bible, till and keep. Words which, as I said last Sunday, are not dominating words. They do not mean to manipulate or own. They mean to serve, to preserve, and guard. But humankind failed in that command. We did not serve the earth and did not serve God, the owner. The diminishing of species, the polluting of air, water, and soil, drought, flood, and fire, the moral decline of anxious humans who turn to violence for survival, all of this was foreseen by the prophet as the predictable outcome of disobedience. Now, when we hear all this about God's judgment, we can easily make some bad moves theologically. We can blame the environmental crisis on God. We can spiritualize climate change. We aren't causing it by our lifestyle or actions. This is just another sign of the end times caused by God as punishment for our sin and spiritual failures. That argument has been used by Christians to excuse inaction. Everything's going to burn up anyway, because that is God's will for disobedient people. That's a bad move theologically, because we are taking a worldview from ancient times and applying it directly to our world today. I believe that we can still take God's judgment seriously and recognize that we generally bring it on ourselves through the destructive and evil consequences of our actions. We can take full responsibility and recognize God's presence even in the midst of it. That's why I wanted us to hear this awful text. Terrible things have happened on the earth and are still happening. And they came about because, as the prophet says, we have transgressed laws and broken the everlasting covenant. But just as God is present in the destruction, God is also present in the redemption. And I'll get to that in a few minutes. But first, we want to hear some other voices, some other stories. And I invite Cal Redekop and Eric Beck and Michaela Mast to please come up to the platform right now. And they will be speaking to us in that order. And I asked them to speak to us based on a response to the gospel reading in which Jesus said to his followers that they will see signs of fear and foreboding in the world, but to lift up your heads because your redemption is drawing near. So first Cal, and then Eric, and then Michaela.
Pastor Phil asked me to respond to this question. What is my fear and foreboding versus signs of hope for our Plymouth Earth? In all of 500 words. This may be an oxymoron, but we'll find out. But I want to tell you, Pastor Phil, that I have exactly 499 words. And you all can keep me to that. I'll begin with signs of hope, which is easier. Locally at PVMC, I worship series on environmental crisis, like these series here, panels on our roofs, including the church building here, the Creation Care Committee, and many other activities are giving a powerful message to our community. 2, members are increasingly using fossil-free solar energy for homes and businesses. 3, members are active in community organizations that are promoting, sustaining, and restoration of Mother Earth. For example, the Community Action Alliance of the Valley, which I'm sure many of us belong to. 4th, members are participating in local and area political action for pro-environmental candidates and policies. PVMC is an area leader, so let us each congratulate by giving each other a hand. I wish I could name names, but it was too many. By the way, I just wonder why Pastor Phil chose me to make this presentation, because there are many other people who are much better than I am at this. All right, let's go on. Nationally and globally. 1, there is increasing stating the facts by the scientific and financial community on the critical impending crisis. Last week, the International Monetary Fund declared the absolute necessity for an immediate $75 tax per ton on carbon and methane. 2, there is increasingly honest and aggressive reporting in the national and regional press on the increasingly honest and aggressive reporting in the national and regional press on the massive systemic destruction happening right now. 3, increasing agreement on national and political levels of the already approaching point of no return. It's been estimated between 2010 to 2050. Take your choice. Which means the point of no return means that that full restoration of nature is no longer possible. Now I'll go to something more difficult and more in line with what we were hearing this morning from the scriptures. Signs of fear and foreboding. Number one, globally, most effort and resources are still being spent on adapting to the consequences, adapting the consequences of the crisis, such as moving to higher ground, rather than demolishing the causes. For example, abolishing carbon and methane in the Paris Climate Agreement of 2016. 2. World religions vary from outright rejection of environmental concern, such as the American right wing, Christianity, to pro-nature religions like Buddhism. 3. Multinational corporations and business enterprises are battling carbon taxes and other restrictions, mining and ravaging the earth, namely mortgaging the future. 4. The majority of humans prefer immediate gratification to avoid the longer range planning and cost involved for future benefits. Even PVMC friends ask, what is the payback involved? What is the payback for solar? I'll reply, what is it for oil? 5. Human arrogance assumes it is impossible that humans could be destroying their own habitat. Confer Pastor Phil's last Sunday sermon on humans challenging God. 6. We continue to ignore the connection between the increasing production-consumer human reproduction cycle, which is destroying the balance of our finite ecosystem. I think I'll read that again. We ignore the connection between the increasing production-consumption human reproduction cycle, which is destroying the balance of our finite ecosystem. Everything is in balance, or it should be. We believe personal lifestyle is our business. Remember Greta Thunberg? 7. We fear change and desire stability and predictability. Business as usual is the most comfortable lifestyle. 8. Finally, we deny we are the causes of the environmental crisis. Recently, Pope Francis said, we humans are the problem. We reject scientific understanding of nature and cling to traditional sacred texts, which do not help very much our lack of knowing how to act responsibly for the well-being of home. What I'm saying is that the sacred texts describe what the problems are and what we should be aware of them, but they give us very little information on how we really grasp the situation, which science is helping us. Conclusion. We will lose the race between global destruction and our actions to save it unless we act immediately. Nature will survive, but with a vengeance. Tornadoes, hurricanes, droughts, floods, fires. Anyone? Not in the form that will be good for our grandchildren. I sincerely hope I am wrong.
I had about 577 words. I think Cal took 342, so that leaves me with some room to go with a stream of consciousness, maybe. The scripture today was one that I think is used often for fear and shame. I don't like to be motivated by those reasons. I feel like there needs to be motivations otherwise that are more positive. I've had many influences over my life that have caused me to care about creation. I'll speak to two of them. One was 2 summers I spent 2 summers as a canoe guide in the wilderness of Ely, Minnesota, in the Boundary Waters, working for a Mennonite camp, guiding canoe trips, weeks at a time. The integration of the scripture with the times we were out in the water traveling is very physical, is very visceral in terms of how we impacted the earth. When we take away all the defenses we had around us, it really impacted my thinking in terms of how we need to be and how we need to exist within the systems of nature. The second is a book that I read a few years ago called The 10th Peril. In it defined everything in between the two 10-degree longitudes around the Earth as the most vulnerable to climate change, and that much of our sectarian violence and much of the environmental issues that we have in terms of diminishing resources are fought there, and that's where people are most vulnerable. I think Cal spoke very well of the dangers that are happening. Phil also asked me to speak to this in terms of my chosen profession as a builder. I refer to science. There are a multitude of lists to what we can do and what we need to prioritize. And that gives me energy, and that's interesting for me, and it's fascinating, and it's nice to work at these things. I think part of that issue is that many of the things we're working at that we can tick off are not obvious or not visible, and we need to play for the long game rather than the short game. But as I referred to a list from Project Drawdown, which ranks actions that we can take to lower the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere and reduce global warming by 2050. So technically speaking, there are a lot of good things, and there are a lot of things that intersect with what we do as what I do as a builder. Number 1 is refrigeration management, then wind turbines on land, reduced food waste, plant-rich diets, tropical forests, and then came 6 and 7, excuse me, which shocked me out of that professional technical context into something different. It feels like some of these initiatives tend to be somewhat sterile, somewhat lacking of heart and soul, just technical things we can do to protect the earth. 6 and 7 were educating girls and women in family planning. Defined as healthcare, meeting women's expressed needs, empowerment, equality, and well-being. Combine those to launch that to number 1. Combined it in reference, I'm not sure the reference of this, but I believe it was 100, slightly over 100 gigatons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And that was nice. That was nice to see that we can take efforts that we sometimes forget those human relationships and focus on the technical. And that those efforts are important. And it took me back to those times in Wilderness Wind when we were talking about theology and we were talking about the intersect of environment and our belief patterns. And it reminded me of what we've done in our Christian faith to harm everything. Specifically dominion over the earth instead of caretakers of, bald-faced or disguised patriarchy that gives cover for domination over or condemnation of anyone or thing not deemed masculine enough. Mission initiatives that are more about colonialism than service of other cultures. And teachings on salvation that place too much emphasis on the hereafter than the here and now. And prosperity gospels that place vulnerability, shame, and blame on the poor. I'm very hopeful because I see movements around me in this area specifically that are working towards that intersection of environmental justice and climate change and poverty, and that work at education in the community, that work at encouraging people, mission initiatives that are seeking to lessen the impact of drought, such as some of the small sand dam projects that MCC and others are working on in the parts of Africa in a lot of drought. Small solar initiatives that bring light to distant communities that can extend reading time and learning time. And then large and small efforts to reduce energy needs, improve carbon sequestration, develop alternative energy. This large and small efforts to restore us to each other in creation bring confidence that we can make it through this global crisis. I often think in the overwhelmingness of it all that the cliche, we have to think globally and act locally, and I think that's important to do. Thank you.
Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to share with you this morning. I'll be sharing a piece of my heart. These are stories that I don't tell lightly. They're thoughts that shape my world and guide my decisions and weigh on my shoulders every single day. So thank you for sitting with me in my anxieties and questions, sorrows, and dreams this morning. The words climate change used to shut me down a little bit. I'd hear them and inevitably feel repelled. Consciously, or at least subconsciously, those words were associated with a sense of implication and of guilt. They were associated with feelings of isolation, paralysis, uncertainty, and tension. And often I found my body's response was to put on a face of indifference. Shut it down, don't even go there, said my brain. And even after an entire year of dedicating 8 hours a day to the topics of climate change, justice, and the church, I'm still met with uncertainty, sorrow, and fear. But I'm reminded that God can work with that. After all, God is a God of mystery and restoration. So this morning, you'll start to see what it's been like for me to lean into the realities of climate change. The first story I have for you comes from a man named Saulo Padilla. Saulo's cordial, kind, and centered, even over the phone. He immigrated from Guatemala as a youth and now works as the Immigration Education Coordinator for MCC. Just last year, Saulo walked the Migrant Trail, which is a 75-mile path that thousands of migrants take on their way to the United States. The trail crosses the desert that lies just south of the US border. Saulo has walked this trail a couple times now in honor of the 10,000 migrants who have died along it. He told us of the backpacks and empty water jugs that litter the trail. In recent years, he said, the journey across the desert has become even more dangerous. The wall along our southern border is being built in strategic areas in order to push people to the most treacherous parts of the desert. A lethal deterrent, the US is calling it. And it is lethal, said Saulo, but it's not working as a deterrent. Already this year, in just the first 5 months of 2019, the number of people arriving at our southern border surpassed the average number we've seen every year in the past 2 decades. In May 2019 alone, 132,000 people arrived at the border seeking asylum. 11,000 of those were unaccompanied children. 84,000 more were members of family units. Saulo shared some of the messages he hears from those he meets at the border. No hay lluvia, say some, there's no rain. And it's true, there's a segment of Central America known as the Dry Corridor. It's a triangle of land that includes parts of Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua that have been experiencing devastating drought for 10 years now. For most people living in those areas, sustenance farming is what sustains them. And so as the droughts worsen, two things happen. First off, there's conflict over the remaining resources. And second, people move, often to the cities. But the trouble with the cities is that they're not equipped for such an influx of people. And so with the population growth in the cities comes poverty and crime. Poverty and crime, the main push factors Salo hears about from migrants. As the climate continues to change, more and more families are being uprooted, forced to leave their homes in fear of their own safety. So as we discuss climate change, we must remember the immigrant. Thinking of one without the other just does not give us the full picture. I also interviewed a man named Kevin King. Kevin's name may be familiar to you. He's the director of MDS, Mennonite Disaster Services. Kevin is very familiar with the devastation and trauma experienced with the loss of a home. He's been coordinating disaster relief in Canada and the US for over 15 years now. When he first began this position 15 years ago, Kevin was accustomed to responding to 3 or 4 major disasters in a year. That's 3 or 4 major hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, or the likes. Now, 15 years later, the number of major disasters MDS responds to has quadrupled. Kevin said that instead of 3 to 4 disasters, he's been seeing 15 to 20 every year. And this is just in the US and Canada. And as you can imagine, when disaster strikes, it is those already on the margins of a community, those without resources, who have the hardest time adapting and who suffer the most. So as we examine our role in climate change, we must not forget that we are talking about the widow, the orphan, the oppressed, and the homeless. Kevin and Salo are certainly not the only ones noticing the troubling trends accompanying climate change. The United Nations University estimates that by 2050, 200 million people will be displaced from their homes due to climate change and the natural disasters, food insecurity, and water scarcity that follow. Take into account the violence stirred up when resources are lacking, and the numbers get even bigger. Some sources predict the displacement of up to 1 billion people by 2050. So you see, climate change is not just some far-off abstraction. It's about the security and health of people and their homes. The last story comes from a friend of mine, whom I will call Sam. Sam is a 3rd grader at Smithland Elementary, the local city school I'm working at this year. And for Sam, home is a volatile, unstable place. When he comes to school, his mind is saturated with images and thoughts of stress. He carries recent memories of angry parents, of young siblings that land in his care, and he lives with the realities of food shortages and a persistent fear for his own safety. For Sam, a sense of belonging is hard to come by, and his body has become well-trained. His mind has adjusted, the pathways in his brain altered by repeated trauma to protect himself. And so at the slightest sign of stress, Sam's body enters survival mode. It might be a math problem or a slight provocation from another student that sends him into a flurry of anger or fear or self-doubt or anxiety, all strong, debilitating emotions that have a way of warping his reality. And this is why relationships are hard for Sam. His self-preservation instincts tell him to keep his guard up, to protect himself from further instability and pain. Every day, I see the way that trauma alters the life of that one resilient child. The lack of physical and emotional security we see in Sam will be multiplied again and again in those 200 million people who will be displaced in the next 30 years by climate change. Think of the loss of lives, the violence within communities, the devastation of whole ecosystems, of the injustice, grief, and trauma that is sure to accompany those numbers. We must not take that lightly. But there must be hope somewhere, right? Well, I can tell you that this morning I feel hope. This morning I feel joy. And what brings me that joy? It's this, that a community of believers that believes in a life of abundance, that is willing to hold our brokenness and pain together, a community of believers that has a moral framework that cares for the marginalized and the poor, and views all living things as integral to our well-being. That we are here this morning, even if it's just the very beginning, to look the ugliness and despair of this world right in the face and say, no, we have a different way. That brings me joy. We will come together and ask hard questions. We will love all of our neighbors with a fervor that does not ignore the perils of this world. We will act upon our conviction that God is on a mission of peace, justice, and restoration, and that we are a part of it. What gives me hope is that we are sitting here as a church community with a handbook, a guide to living with humility and uplifting the voices of children and widows and the imprisoned and the oppressed, the undocumented and the displaced and the homeless. That's what we're about. In the words of Krenagor, a very wise woman I met during my travels, if church communities go to the front lines of ecological devastation and wait for God in those locations, then there's going to be a miraculous result. We have seen the way God can move in broken places. And so what brings me hope is that leaning into the realities of climate change could very well be an opportunity to breathe life into the church and its people. So more than ever, what I desire is to be in a community that is willing to feel unsettled together, to recognize the missteps that we take every day together, and to be bold together in exploring what it means to live in loving relationship. As the world presses in, I'm convinced that the greatest strength is hope in the face of reality, a hope that takes note of the world and still decides to love. And I'm grateful this morning to be doing that together.
Thank you so much, Cal and Eric and Michaela. As we have seen and heard so eloquently from these three speakers, despair and hopelessness is not the way forward for us as people of faith. Others may well despair, but we have a larger view of our place in the universe and the relationship of our Creator to this universe. We believe that God owns this place and has not forgotten about it. We believe that God is still at work for the healing of the nations and the healing of creation itself. We believe that all of creation is waiting and groaning with a deep longing for the redemption that is coming. And we believe that as God's collaborators, we are part and parcel of what God is up to. As the Apostle Paul says in Romans 8, all creation is groaning as in childbirth, and we are groaning inwardly as we and all creation await redemption. Redemption is coming. As the prophet Isaiah himself said in the next chapter after that most hopeless text in the Bible, after that is perhaps the most sublime treatise on redemption in the Bible. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines, and he will destroy on this mountain the shroud that is cast over all peoples. The Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces, and the disgrace of his people he will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. And as Jesus told his disciples in Luke 12, another text we heard this morning, after listing all those signs of foreboding, he said, "Now when these things begin to take place, stand up and raise your heads, for your redemption is near." Now again, if we do not take care, we can make a bad theological move. We can look at our coming redemption, this Son of Man coming in the clouds, and see an excuse for inaction. No, that is never what Jesus intended. The reason for all these biblical warnings, these signs of foreboding, is so that we can stay awake and alert and fully cognizant of God's presence in our midst. It is an antidote to despair. God's coming redemption of the heavens and the earth is not something being done to us by a God up there who wants to whisk us away from this evil physical world. No, we participate in God's saving and redeeming action now. Redemption is not a panacea. It's not an escape. It is never an excuse not to act or not to make sacrifices. The promise of redemption is simply this: it's confidence about where all this is eventually heading. The historical arc of God's action in history is always toward shalom, toward wholeness, toward life. We cannot know now how that will all unfold and when, but our vocation, our calling is to be God's active partners in redemption. We must care and care deeply. We must act and act boldly. We must love and love sacrificially. I thank God for these three that shared their stories and who are on the journey together with the rest of us. And I am deeply concerned about what is happening to God's good earth. But it is still God's good earth. And I am full of hope in God, the redeeming one. With the hymn writer Thomas Troger, I confess that by Christ we are connected to every shining star, to every atom spinning, to all the things that are, and to your very being, around, below, above, suffusing each dimension with light and life and love. Let's sing together the hymn that's printed in our bulletin.